So at the end of our reading last week, Mark tells us that Jesus, about halfway through the first chapter of Mark, is already famous. People had begun to figure out who he was. Now, as an aside, in Mark's gospel, there is this thing, and it's a fancy term, so stay with me for a minute. It's called the Messianic secret. I paid a lot of money in seminary to learn that term, but what it means is that Jesus doesn't want people to find out too quickly who he is. He's got a lot to teach, and he doesn't want them to think that they have figured him out. And so Jesus is kind of keeping people at arm's length, and he's trying to continue doing what he needs to do before people think they have him figured out. When you're famous, people think they know you. See your picture up on TV or on Facebook or on your iPad or your cell phone, and so we think that people are famous. So a little bit of a map here. This is the Sea of Galilee, okay? Jesus spent a lot of his time around the Sea of Galilee. Today, Mark tells us that he is in the city of Capernaum. So we're at the north end of the Sea of Galilee. Nazareth is over here. That's where Jesus was born, and about 27 miles from Nazareth to Capernaum. And then we see Tiberias, we see Cana. John's gospel tells us about the first miracle, water into wine. That's a happy miracle for many of us. Bethsaida is there. So this is the Sea of Galilee. It's sort of backcountry. South of here is Jerusalem, where all of the big important people live and where the heads of the church spend their time, but Jesus is mostly in Galilee. One of the interesting things about this story is that Mark tells us that Peter was married, and he implies that because Peter has a mother-in-law, okay? If you're married, you have a mother-in-law and a father-in-law. It also means that you have a wife. Now, we don't know the name of Peter's wife. There are a lot of legends, but the fact that Peter was married is kind of interesting. Peter loved his mother-in-law, and he cared about her, which is why Jesus was called. I can tell there are some mothers-in-law in the crowd. Peter loved his mother-in-law, and they called Jesus to heal her. But what I think is interesting, and I'm just going to spend about 30 seconds, is that Peter was married, according to Mark, and he had a wife, many had mother and father-in-law, and he becomes the rock upon which Jesus builds the church, and then there's a lot of tradition that goes with that. So anyhow, I think that's kind of interesting and has nothing to do with what I want to talk about today, but kind of interesting. So, mother-in-law of Peter has a fever. How many of you have had the flu this season? Show of hands, okay? How many of you know somebody who has had the flu? Most of us, okay. So if you've had the flu or if you know someone who has the flu, how do you feel when you have the flu? Feel terrible. How do you feel when you have the flu? You get the chills. You're tired. You feel like you're going to die. You feel like you're going to burn up, right, with the fever, and you kind of just want to be left alone, right? There's an interesting article in the paper yesterday, and somebody actually gave it to me, a little clip that said, during the flu season, instead of sharing the peace with a handshake, we should share the peace with a fist bump. Because why? We want to be sure we don't get too close to people who are sick, and we kind of distance ourselves frequently from people who are sick. And so this is the plight of Peter's mother-in-law. She has the flu. She has a terrible fever. So we know that there is power when we reach out our hands in a variety of good and healthy and life-giving ways. When we shake a person's hand and make an agreement, we make a promise, right? And so there's something powerful about shaking each other's hands. Sometimes people are feeling like they're in the dark and kind of feeling alone and kind of feeling like people are distant, and so people reach out hoping that somebody's hand will reach back and will restore them, bring them back from darkness to light. There is powerful stuff that happens in that. Here you have a couple, let's say they've been married for 65 years. I think of my mom and dad when I see this couple, and look how tenderly they are holding each other's hands. There is love in that hand holding. There is compassion in those hands reaching out to each other. There is grace and there is healing in that hand holding. Here you see a young child after a terrible earthquake in Nepal, and you see the rescue workers, and you see them taking this child by the hand and lifting that child up, and look at the care and concern in their eyes. Their hands have been a healing force. Here's a mom. We put our hands on the foreheads of people we know and we love, and somehow that's an act of love. Let's see how hot your forehead is, and depending upon how hot it is, maybe we need more medicine, maybe you need to just go to bed, have some chicken soup, whatever it is, but the hand on the forehead from a parent to a child is an act of compassion and love. So, Jesus reaches out, all right, to the mother-in-law of Peter, and he reaches out with his hand, and he lifts her up, and by that action of love and compassion, the fever goes away. So I want you to go with me for just a minute, just a quick little teaching here that I think might be interesting. It is to me. I hope it is to you. So when Peter's mother-in-law is healed, Mark tells us that she rises up. All right? She stands up. The word that is used to describe rise up in this story in the Greek is the same word that is used to describe what happens to Jesus. The woman is brought from death to life, and she rises up. Jesus is brought from death to life, and he rises up. And so this woman rises from the dead. And then once she is risen, she goes about her normal work. She serves her family. Maybe she mows the lawn. Maybe she does her dishes. Maybe she waits for her husband to do some of those things. But life as normal returns. She is a servant. Now, serving in the Gospel of Mark is a big deal. We go to Mark 10. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man, and that's Jesus, came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So listen, here's what's happening in the Gospel of Mark. Before the end of the first chapter, this woman who rises up and who serves is among the first disciples. And if you are a girl or a woman here today, I want you to hear that one of the earliest disciples is a woman in the Gospel of Mark. Yes! Thank you, Sophie, for the amen back there. One of the first disciples is a woman. Things might someday get so out of control that a woman might even be able to become a bishop in the Lutheran Church. Things are way out of control. It's a wonderful thing that Jesus calls this woman, and that our bishop is the 12th or 13th woman to be called to the office of bishop in this big church that we are a part of. And if you are a girl or a woman, and if you wonder what God might do with your life, and if somebody like me might say to you, you could be a pastor or a bishop, I want you to know it's true. All of you high school youth back there, all of you girls and guys, but one of the first disciples of Mark is a woman. So we have this amazing story, and what happens is that people in town hear about Jesus, and they come to him in this big crowd around his house. And they come because they've got problems too. They come because they want to get close to Jesus. They come because they hope that his hand will reach out to heal them too. And so this big crowd of people comes. Last week, we talked about the fact that when people are ill with the flu or lots of other illnesses, we stigmatize people. And we do it. And here we are again in the Gospel of Mark, and people who are really sick are stigmatized. Last week we talked about this boundary of clean and unclean, and that Jesus trampled on that boundary and went to the dark and the unclean and the nasty places of the world to reach out with his hand and to heal. If you're in a place, and some of you might be now, where you feel like you've been boxed in by other people, boxed in by your circumstances, you feel isolated, and you wonder if anybody will reach over with a hand and pull you over the brick wall that separates you between people you love and yourself. We have all these labels for people who are sick. The flu is one that we can accept, but we put labels on people who struggle with all kinds of things like AIDS and depression and even diabetes or other kinds of illnesses that hit people, and so we put labels. Here's the picture of a guy, and he represents for me mental illness, which I think is one of the truly misunderstood ailments in American culture here in 2018. When somebody has diabetes, what do we give them? Insulin. And when somebody is sick with diabetes, when my brother was diagnosed when he was 11 years old and he went to the hospital with a blood sugar count of 700 and his life was saved by insulin, people didn't say to him, "What's wrong with you, Kevin? You've got diabetes." But when it comes to mental illness, we misunderstand it in some powerful and damaging ways. We think that we ought to just be able to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. Some of us can do that, but some of us can't. I guarantee, if we stop for a second and think about the people in our lives, each of us knows somebody who is struggling with that kind of illness. In my own family, we have folks who struggle with bipolar disorder and borderline personality and autism spectrum and all the rest, and my guess is some of you do too. It's so misunderstood. People who are mentally ill need for us to reach our hands out and to bring them from darkness into light, and those are the kinds of people who come to Jesus looking for the same kind of healing. Our families, not easy to talk about, but our families are sometimes shattered as well. Marriage difficulties, problems with parents and children and extended families and aunts and uncles and grandparents and all the rest. And so we bring our broken families to Jesus, and we hope that his hands can bring us together and heal us. And that's all of us. And so we come with that. Look at this guy who's in solitary confinement. How many of you like to spend time alone? All right. How many of you would like to spend time alone in a box about 8 feet by 8 feet with no windows for about 2 years? How many of you would love to do that? This guy is in solitary confinement, the worst place to be, because we're made to be in relationships. And look at him. He's desperate to have a human touch. He is in pain, and somebody, by simply touching him with a healing hand, can bring some kind of renewal. No matter what kind of crime, we desperately need a healthy touch, a hand to reach out to us. People who are homeless, we often think, well, people are homeless because they want to, or they made bad choices, or they blew their money. The reality is that many of us are a paycheck away from that kind of situation. And yet we want to distance ourselves when, in fact, homeless people desperately need us to reach out with a hand. Doesn't have to even be money. It could simply be a handshake or a grabbing of the hand and reminding people that they matter. So, Jesus does all this stuff, and then Mark tells us, it's kind of an interesting story, that Jesus snuck out the back door. All right, he snuck out the back door, and the reason that he did was because he wanted to get away from what he was doing for a while. He needed to press the pause button. He needed to stop for just a minute because he was tired. It was time for a break. He needed to get away from all of these demands. Mom, we need you 24/7. Dad, you can't go away. I've got to have your help. My friends, I got to have you 24/7. You can't take a break. I need you. We need you, but even Jesus needed to take a break. Even Jesus needed to take a break. The human Jesus needed to take a break. I want you to say this with me. Go ahead. Even Jesus needed to take a break. You didn't believe that. Let's try again. Even Jesus needed to take a break. Even Jesus needed to pause. It's kind of what we try to do around here on Wednesday nights. To pause, to come and have a meal that is prepared for us, to come and participate in choir or class or whatever. If Jesus needed to take a break, it's okay for us to take a break as well. He takes a break because he needs to pray. Hear that. Jesus, Son of God, Son of Man, the human one, needs to pray. And so he takes a break to pray. I try to come into the office early most days, and typically try to get here before most other people get here and come here to have some quiet time. And so I go into my office and turn on the lights, and I have my cup of coffee from Tim Hortons, of course, Terry, and sit down, and I'm going to have some quiet time. And then I sit down, and here's the list for the week. You been there? I open my computer, and it's over. Right? You've been there. The time to pray is over. And so what I want to invite us to think about in our lives is taking time to pause, taking a break, take some time to pray, and to ask Jesus to be healing presence in our lives and to ask us to be the same. Martin Luther, who was the monk in 1517 or so, who set off a firestorm in the church throughout Europe and ultimately the rest of the world, and that still reverberates today. He said this about prayer: I have so much to do today that I shall spend the first 3 hours in prayer. Talk about counterintuitive. Now, whether Luther said those exact words or not, we don't know, but if he didn't, he should have, because he was trying to tell us something about the importance of prayer when we are so busy and the world is driving us just like it drove Jesus. So, he presses the pause button, he sneaks away, and people were told they're hunting for him. Where is he? It's frantic. It's like you can't take a break. It's like, we need you. And so they come looking for him, and his disciples say, Jesus, everybody's looking for you. How dare you take a break? And so finally he says, all right, we'll go again. I am recharged. I am ready to go. So let's go throughout the region, and we're going to share the good news, the story that I came to bring. So here we are as Jesus people, and here we are as people committed, I hope, to prayer, committed, I hope, to stepping back a little bit, and we are invited to dare to reach out our hands into the darkness, to put another hand into the light. So I want us today to think about the people in our world and the people we'll encounter this week, people in the darkness that need us to reach out to them, that need us to be a healing presence in the name of Jesus. And I want us to think about our families. I want us to think about classmates at school. I want us to think about people where we work. And I want us to think about what it might mean to reach out with a hand and to grab another's hand and to share compassion. I want us to think about who those people might be. And I want us to think about what it might mean to reach out with that kind of compassion. Now, not everybody will welcome it. We know that by the end of Mark's gospel, Jesus goes to the cross, gives his life, but we also know that he rises up in the same way that the mother-in-law of Peter rose up, and so we will too. So think about it. Just for a second here. Step away this week. Spend some time in prayer. Ask Jesus to show you the people you need to reach out to. You can reach out to. And see how God's grace can flow through us as we share that love with a simple hand reached out to another.